Soccerex Connected, day one, Ben Jacobs with you. Our theme is governance, law and finance, and it's presented by the Johan Cruyff Institute. We'll hear from them throughout the week. And because Cruyff had many different nicknames, including the skinny one and also the saviour, we're asking you to stand a chance of winning a signed shirt. You can see all the different options that you can pick from via our Twitter at Soccerex. We're asking you, what is your nickname? Or alternatively, what's your favourite nickname for a footballer? Get in contact with us. Use that hashtag Soccerex Connected. And we've had loads of you giving us lots of fun nicknames, including the baby-faced assassin. That one's popular. Thank you very much, Casey, for tweeting us, and even one for the assassin-faced baby, which was a pun on Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's nickname given to Wayne Rooney by a national newspaper a few years back. A little bit harsh, but a clever play nonetheless when they were both at Manchester United. So if you'd like the chance to win that signed shirt, just tell us either your nickname or your favourite footballer's nickname, and we'll announce the winner at the end of day on social media and reiterate that winner to tomorrow morning when I'm joined by Patrick McKenna, the head of sales and marketing for Soccerex, and we will look ahead to the day in around 15 minutes. So day two coming up. Full schedule is available on our website and also the app. And please do keep engaging, take network meetings, and the exhibitors also have a strong digital presence too. So make sure that you interact with them to give this really a conference-like feel, even though we are, of course, socially distanced. So let's move on to our 5 o'clock panel now. It's another good title, this one. Where we're going, we don't need quotas. And a huge part, of course, of good governance, which is part of the theme of the day, is in promoting inclusion and diversity. And 2020 and the early part of 2021 have thankfully seen a big surge in athlete-led activism. Marcus Rashford is, of course, the most notable example in football, but even outside of football, Atlanta Dream's Vote Warnock campaign helped the Democrats gain control of the Senate in America, and that proved pivotal to, and again, showcased athlete-led activism around diversity and inclusion. So for the next 45 minutes, debating what exactly equality looks like at the moment and how long it's going to take to fully level the playing field. We're delighted to be joined by Ebru Koksal, the chair of Women in Football, Edleen John, the International Corporate Affairs and co-partner for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Director at the Football Association, and Evan Whitfield, the attorney at law at the firm Schiller, DuCanto and Fleck. And your moderator is Jon Holmes, senior editor at Sky Sports and also the founder of sports media LGBT+. Jon, it's a very good afternoon to you. Always enjoy reading your work, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Hi, everybody. Welcome along to this Soccerex Connected panel. As Ben says, we're going to be exploring the ongoing quest for equality in football, and our discussion is titled Quota, where we're going, we don't need quotas. And we've got 3 fantastic panelists who are going to be exploring that with us today. As Ben says, my role is with Sky Sports, and I also lead a network advisory and consultancy group called Sports Media LGBT+. So the aims of our session is to identify the progress that we're making in terms of the fight against discrimination, particularly over the last 12 months. We're also going to be looking at where we should be focusing our efforts in 2021 and providing some actionable suggestions for all of you to take away in order to help make the game a little bit more beautiful for everyone. So I'm going to go to each of our panelists in turn. Obviously, Ben has kind of teed them up for me, but I'll give you a little bit of extra information. And as I go to each of you, I'm going to ask you as well if you can pick out one breakthrough moment for equality in football from the last year. So hopefully you'll have those ready for us and reflecting on 2020. So Ebru, I'll come to you first. As Ben said, the chair of Women in Football, over 20 years experience in top level administration in the game. Particularly your roles at Galatasaray and with the Turkish Football Federation. It's lovely to have you with us. What was your breakthrough moment from 2020?
Thank you very much, Jon. I guess it's not one single, but for me, of course, the whole equal pay movement has been really breathtaking, and the kind of advocacy work that the US Women's National Team did, and especially how sponsors actually jumped in and supported them. And of course, FIFA came in with continued support in terms of committed budgets over $1 billion for women's football. Some new measures came in, and also in the UK, hashtag enough movement. I think were all important movements to follow.
Thank you. Yes, that hashtag enough movement. I know that's started up by the PFA, which is another organisation where you're taking a pivotal role. So yeah, that's a really great example. Moving on next to Edleen. Edleen, great to see you too. The FA's Director of International Relations, Corporate Affairs and Co-Partner for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. We know about your leadership roles previously in finance and business, and you've brought a lot to the organisation in the time that you've been there. What was your choice moment from 2020 where you saw equality beginning to make strides?
Yeah, thank you so much, John. Delighted to be here. I think for me, a breakthrough moment has got to be the momentum that we've seen from the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's not just a key moment in the world of football, but frankly, globally. And it's meant that people have had to stop, take a moment, pause, reflect, and think about what we do need to be doing to drive forward equality of opportunity, equality of access, and really change across a number of institutions and organizations that have such a cultural impact. And of course, we know that sport, and indeed football, is a critical one for so many across the globe. So for me, that has been a moment whereby anybody across the football landscape, be it player, be it administration, be it any kind of stakeholder, has had to stop and reflect and think, what is it that we can be doing differently, and where and how can we embed that accountability?
Absolutely, and I know we're going to be dipping a little more into the FA's actionable moments that they've taken from that message, and we'll find out a little bit more about that in due course. Last part, my name is Elise Evans. We're coming to you, a footballer who made over 100 appearances in Major League Soccer and also represented your country at an Olympic Games, now leading on anti-racism initiatives with Street Football World USA and Common Goal. And I know you also have other diversity inclusion projects, which I'm sure we're going to learn more about in today's discussion. So what was your moment? And perhaps it might even have been one that you've been involved in personally.
Certainly, in building off of Edleen, the recognition of the Black Lives Matter movement and the scope and breadth that's taken, especially here in the United States, in Chicago, where I'm based. And importantly, the activation of the athletes. So as a member of SCORE, Soccer Collective on Racial Equity, a number of notable former Black USA internationals have bound together, that in with conjunction with the Black Players for Change, which are the active MLS players, the Black Players Alliance of USL, which is the equivalent of the second division in the States, and then the NWSL Black Players Alliance, Black Players Coalition, which are the active members of the Women's League here in the US. That building of community and that activation and interfacing with the respective leagues is, to me, the keystone of all the work that's happening from an institutional level with our two other great guests.
So perhaps we should start with the point that Ebru raised first, and that was, I think, around the steps forward in terms of equality for women in football. Obviously, nobody better placed to talk about that than the chair of Women in Football. Ebru, why is kind of one of the things we were exploring, why is gender equality still so widely seen as something that's nice to have rather than need to have?
Well, institutionally, unfortunately, discrimination has continued to exist in the industry for many, many years. It was always seen as an old boys club, and there were very few of us 20 years. I'm very happy to see today there are many, many more women represented at all levels of the game, on the pitch, on the side of the pitch, in the boardroom. And that's been a long journey for most of us. And Women in Football is a network of 4,500 professional women working in and around the game, mainly in the UK, but almost 20% of our membership base is from abroad. And we've been really holding the pulse very quickly with surveys that we do, roundtables, webinars. Especially 2020, through the pandemic, we remained very close to our membership base. And what we keep hearing is, while the landscape is improving for women in the game, there are still some significant obstacles. And if we talk a little bit about the survey that we have recently done, the headline came out quite a bit. 66% of the women witnessed discrimination, and only 12% chose to report it, which shows the big gap in the institutional cultures and the inclusive leadership that is still lacking, unfortunately. And when we look through the roots of it, we also see that a lot of the times women at the receiving end identify an action or a behavior as discriminatory, but unfortunately, maybe at the other end, their male colleagues are not necessarily aware of what they're doing are wrong and unacceptable. But there is also good news. Around 80% of the women feel that they are supported by their colleagues at the workplace. 60% of them feel that their employer supports them. So there is definitely good news, but still a lot of room to improve. And I think still the reason why there is a lack of complete buy-in is prejudices, biases, and a whole change of system from recruitment to induction to retention needs to be revisited by all the organizations.
Edleen, coming from a different sector into football, what were your thoughts on gender equality in the game, as you came into your role, and what have you learned? I know it's only been a few months, but perhaps you've been able to already make some perceptions about how things are.
Sure. So building on what Ebru said, I think the critical element of challenge or difference in the world of football is actually that culture of inclusion. I think the very nature of football historically has meant it has at times very much felt like an old boys network. And with that can sometimes come an element of what you could call locker room banter or inappropriate comments. And representation helps to move us slightly further along the way in terms of having people from different backgrounds and more women in boardrooms, in locker rooms, and as Ebru said, on and off the pitch. However, if there isn't that culture of inclusion, there still isn't a sense of people feeling empowered to speak up when they're seeing activities or behaviors that are inappropriate. And there isn't that level of psychological safety, which is quite important within any institution, within any team environment, or indeed within the landscape of sport, whereby people feel they can challenge those behaviors and still be part of the group or part of the team or respected to the same level. And so I think for me, what I have seen in my short time of football is that we need to do quite a bit of work around that culture of inclusion and challenging those behaviors, inappropriate comments, or doing things in the way in which we've always done them, just because that's the way in which it's always been done. And I feel like I've had a suite of conversations within my short tenure where people have said, oh yeah, that's the way in which this organization have always done this, or that's the way in which that stakeholder's always done that. And it's about feeling empowered and feeling supported to say that may be the way in which it's always been done, but that doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. And I think as it relates to banter and the culture of inclusion, particularly for people from underrepresented groups, be that females, ethnic minorities, et cetera, that's always been a consistent challenge and something I think we all have a role and responsibility to really drive forward in terms of change.
Mm. And Evan, as a male ally in this space, what would be your take on how things are progressing? One of the things I was looking at for this panel was some research that was done in the Netherlands, where discussions with men working in professional football and raising the point of gender equality, and often there seemed to be a desire by these individuals to pull it back to the increased visibility of the women's game and women and girls playing the game, but actually there still seemed to be that lack of awareness around the challenges that women face in terms of making a career professionally.
Yeah, I hear you there. I guess I'll kind of redirect it though. I think that one of the things that Ebru stated, which I think is so important, is the inclusivity of leadership. Here in the States, our former president of U.S. Soccer very poorly handled the litigation against the women's team. And they took some very aggressive, quite egregious stances that he tried to distance himself from, which ended in his resignation. And then to appoint a woman who played the game, who has firsthand knowledge and experience with the gender inequities and inequalities and prejudice right? Cindy Parlow-Cohn, for her to become the president, and then quickly within 10 months settle the inequitable working conditions aspect of that lawsuit. I'm not going to say that she's 100% solely responsible for that, but she certainly is a major contributor to that. And I think that is a great case study of how important it is to increase this old boys club, which everyone's referred to, and I'll call it the old white boys club. We need different leaders who look different, who have experienced these things, not just through an academic empathy standpoint, but from a personal lived experience. I think that's where we'll see a lot of these changes occur.
So let's pick up on that point of the old white boys club, and also the, obviously there's lots of references at the beginning to the importance of the Black Lives Matter message. So this particular part of the inclusion picture, there've been lots of initiatives and actions taken by different football organizations across the world. The FA is one that has also been active in this space in introducing the Football Leadership Diversity Code. Edleen, could you tell us a little bit more about that and how that's going to help dismantle this idea of football as an old white boys club?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the back end of the UK's Black History Month in October, we, from an FA standpoint, along with a suite of clubs across the various professional leagues, launched the Football Leadership Diversity Code. And one of the main elements of the code is increasing that accountability and transparency in terms of the representation, both from an administration standpoint within football, but also coaches. When we look at the football pitch, we're able to often see certain elements of diversity quite visibly. We know that if we look at, the Premier League, roughly about 30% of players are of Black heritage or of mixed heritage. And actually, when you look at the administration around the football landscape, that is certainly not the same picture. And to the point that was made previously by Evan, it's very much a white old boys network that you see in terms of the leadership and that professionalism beyond the pitch. And so for us, the code was a way in which we could work with football clubs to help increase that representation throughout the recruitment process, so that people were not just calling on their black book of people they've always worked with and always known, but actually have clear processes and practices in place to increase that equality of opportunity to enter the footballing landscape. And by doing it in a way which encourages clubs and us as the FA and the Premier League and indeed the EFL to also signpost and publicly showcase our data, it means that we're not only accountable to each other, but actually fans will see that information. Players can decide which clubs they may or may not want to go and sign up to. Indeed, broader individuals outside of the landscape of football can decide if this is an industry they want to join. So for us, it was making sure that we embedded that transparency and that accountability in a way that enabled clubs right from the smallest up to the largest to have clear, tangible actions that they could take year on year to increase the diverse representation, both on and off the pitch. And that for us was a real key critical element of the Football Leadership Diversity Code.
Ebru, how is the FLDC and initiatives like that viewed in the football corridors of power, perhaps, that you work in, these kind of initiatives? Obviously, the title of this session is Quotas, Where We're Going, We Don't Need Quotas. But is there still that perception from some people that actions like this is essentially like quotas dressed up as something else?
Well, I'll just give a quick example. The law firm in the UK, Ferrer & Co, actually did a research 2 years ago, published a study, which shows that among the professional clubs, only 3% of them had 30% women on their boards. And 53% of them didn't have any female board members. Flip side, let's look at a code where there was a quota, which is basically the UK sport governance code, and the sports organizations that are funded by UK sport now have on average 40% women on their boards. So one with quota, one there was no code or quota that existed. So in a lot of cultures, actually, this kind of voluntary or mandatory quota actually works well. It just speeds things up and opens up opportunities. The only thing we need to watch out for, obviously, is that it doesn't result in tokenism, and really people are put on these boards or senior management positions or coaching positions based on merit. So that's a very important part. And another, again, thing we're very hopeful about with this code is what Edleen also mentioned, signposting. You know, there's no good information publicly about the workforce and its demographics in football in the UK or globally. So it's really important that at the start of it, those clubs who have signed on or the organizations who have signed on actually take stock and then see in a year, 2, 3, their progress against that. And that's going to really give us a better idea about not just, you know, how many players might be from a certain, you know, background, but really importantly, the workforce. And it will help us to get to know the workforce much better. And again, something very important and very dear to our hearts at Women in Football is this, you know, there's policy, there is the belief and drive, and then the gap in the talent pool. Unfortunately, because historically women and minorities have been overlooked and they're not necessarily as close to senior management roles. And how do we help that? We have leadership courses, we have coaching programs, we have mentoring programs. So we're both supporting to change the decision makers' perceptions, but also trying to get women ready for these more senior management roles all across the game.
Excellent. Edleen is going to have a pick up on a point raised by Ebru.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point that we have to discuss across the football landscape, and that is the clarity of the difference between a quota and a target. So exactly to the point that's been made, we are not by any means advocating with the Football Leadership Diversity Code that people should be put into roles if they don't have the skills and the expertise and the knowledge. And that is what a quota would be, right? That would be, let's tick a box, let's pop someone in there, and that way we can say we've done and we've delivered. For us, it's about having something tangible and measured in the same way that you would for any business in terms of saying we are going to work towards making X amount of revenue in any given year. And so for us, it's about helping clubs to think slightly differently about talent, but also recognizing that talent doesn't need to come just from within the football sphere. So if I look at my own career and my own background, exactly as you said at the beginning, John, I've spent the vast majority of my career within financial services. And if you'd asked me 12, 18 months ago, would I ever have thought that actually a role in football would work for me? I would have said no for all of the reasons that we've discussed here today. So it is about that signposting. It is about making it more accessible to people who maybe do have the transferable skills at that more senior level, to Ebru's point, whereby there is a talent pipeline. There are individuals who would be able to come into the elements of football administration, having worked at a suite of other organizations and from a suite of other industries. But it's making that football landscape accessible, providing that openness of information and saying, actually, we are a culture that welcomes people in, even if they haven't spent 30 or 40 years working within the football world. And I think that is really, really quite important if we want to drive forward that change, because as Ebru said, we may have areas within the football space where we don't have that talent pipeline already ready and sitting at that middle management level, ready to move into senior roles. And so sometimes it's about helping the football landscape to think outside of the box whilst working towards those targets in a way that is focused on merit and not on quotas.
Excellent. I'm just going to come to Evan now to learn a little bit more about how things are progressing in the States, because the leadership code and a lot of these initiatives actually probably trace their origins back to efforts that were made in the States to improve diversity in coaching roles in sport. I'm probably right in saying that, Evan. So perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on how the US player-led organizations are making that step forward.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I would agree with you that a lot of the codes are modeled after things that are happening in National Football League, which all began in the early 2000s. I do want to, before I get into it, I want to make one point. You know, this idea, you know, quotas, and I'm not here to talk about the legality of quotas versus targets in our respective jurisdictions, but you know, everybody uses, not everybody, a lot of people associate the term quota negatively. It's a pejorative term, and it presupposes that if you are a recipient of a quota that you're not qualified. And nothing can be further from the truth. And again, I'm always going to be, you know, a little more verbally aggressive due to my, you know, situation as an advocate, and I'm not negotiating documents with current stakeholders and institutions. But, you know, we're always presupposing, for some strange reason, because the narrative has been built this way, that the people who are currently in these positions have received them because of merit and because they're qualified. I mean, we're talking about sports where most positions don't even have written criteria, right? So to suggest that an individual who is there today received it because they're the most meritorious person and the best person for the job is simply not true. These people are recipients of existing power structures and social structures that choose them over other people. And I don't know any other way to force an individual to do something than some sort of outside rule that, and which these codes, including the Rooney Rule from 2003, they do go a little bit away there, and the signposting is crucial. But I think that the reason why we haven't seen change, and I would caution my colleagues in Europe from relying too much on what we've done in the States, because we haven't done that much. In 2003, when the Rooney Rule was implemented, there were 2 Black coaches. In 2020, 17 years later, there are 3 Black coaches. Now, are we going to suggest that in the NFL, where upwards of 85% of the people are Black who work within that industry, none of those people are qualified? It's an outrageous statement to even suggest. And I'm not saying anybody here is suggesting that. But I really, as an advocate, always working to question those assumptions that so many people have. And we hear a lot about building pipelines and finding qualified candidates. And we all need professional development. I do professional development every year as an attorney. But to suggest that the individuals who are continually coming through in a sport that has such a high attrition rate is ridiculous. People need to be given opportunities. They will learn on the job just like everybody else. I'm sure everybody on this call was not perfect their first day in their respective roles. We all were given opportunities to learn and given access. And that is what, as an advocate, I'm most interested in, continually pushing.
Can you just give us a couple of examples of how organizations that you're involved with or that you kind of have advised in some capacity are doing that? I know you're part of the Soccer Collective on race equality, is that right?
Yeah, Soccer Collective on racial equity SCORE. And, we are outside advocates, attempting to bring Major League Soccer's espoused marketing campaigns and their support of Black Lives Matter, into alignment with their actions. Because today, currently, there's an incongruence there, right? Of course, all the organizations are going to voluntarily support Black Lives Matter and gender equality and all of these things. But we're dealing with private organizations that have the power to create rules as they see fit. And they are not creating rules to actually produce equitable outcomes. If they had been, we wouldn't be here on this panel. So what we're doing is we're using this grassroots collective, action to interface with the leagues. And what does that look like? We wrote a demand letter to Don Garber, the commissioner of MLS. And because we have Eddie Pope and Kobe Jones and DeMarcus Beasley and all these people, he responded to our letter. We then had a Zoom call with him and we demanded answers as to why this inequity exists. And that resulted in part to the creation of the MLS diversity initiatives that were announced in October, which are not nearly as along the lines of the Football Leadership Diversity Code. So kudos to everybody in the UK. But within that process, we're working from the inside, I suppose, in that regard. And as part of that initiative, the MLS Diversity Committee has been established, and there are 2 SCORE members on that committee, Tony Sana and Eddie Pope. And again, this simultaneous advocacy from the outside versus working within the current systems from the inside is where we're looking to make that change. And the Rooney Rule and all the work they're doing, and in the way that it's the iterations that are occurring across Europe, those are all amazing. But we really, really have to push the people in power to make that last concession, which is giving up that power, right? Opening those doors. And it's, again, I'll say it over and over and over again. The only reason that we have inequity in any part of our society, quite frankly, is because the people in power allow it, right? So, as advocates, we need to, force people to be unhappy with that, to publicly speak against it, and then to work outside of systems and inside of systems, such as what we're doing here in the States.
Ebru, Evan picked me up there quite rightly, getting the acronym wrong, because we're talking here really about equity, not equality. And I wanted to ask you about how you're able to kind of communicate the importance of that word to other senior leaders in the game and try to kind of shift their focus into thinking about equity rather than equality.
I mean, interesting enough, as we see the top level decision makers slowly changing generation by generation, it's becoming more natural in their belief systems, and they have really internalized this concept of, you know, equity, equality, inclusion. You don't really have to teach them because this is how they, you know, grew up. So it's more about almost converting them, you know, one by one. It is an effort, but we on our board have 2 male colleagues, for example, who really feel it in their heart that they need to open up the industry for all to access, you know, without any obstacles or hindrances. And they in turn really go and convince other colleagues or other people in their organizations. And what we're also seeing work quite well is when these organizations also start setting up internal networks so that it just trickles down from the top, you know, to all the levels. In some organizations we go to, there's such a big disconnect between the middle level management down and that boardroom, which has historically been very, very much protected. And I mean, as you said at the very beginning, I was the CEO and then board member of Galatasaray for 15 years. I worked with 6 presidents, 10 different boards, and pretty much always I was the only woman there. And the culture and the you know, difficulties of being listened to, being heard, and you know, influencing people and changing minds is quite difficult. And that's where that magic 30% actually comes in. So whether it's the senior management team or the board, the minority representatives stop being a minority when they reach 30% because they don't feel alone. They have somebody to, you know, build coalition with, think like-minded. And also we're seeing more and more that diversity is not necessarily by, you know, looks, but by these converted people who don't necessarily display diverse characteristics, but they have really, you know, really in their hearts the importance of inclusion.
I agree, and I think, you know, we've seen examples of that, and perhaps Edleen, you can maybe tell us a little bit about the experiences at the FA, because we have to acknowledge that there are going to be mistakes and missteps along the way, because, you know, we're breaking new territory here in a lot of cases. How do you ensure an organization stays on track when you're under so much scrutiny like the FA is, and when mistakes are made?
Yeah, I think it is really critical to continue to have open and honest conversations around this area. So for me, it's about, again, creating that environment of psychological safety whereby we're not expecting everybody is going to be an expert on everything equality, diversity, and inclusion related. However, in the current environment and the current society within which we all live and operate, actually, everybody has an individual level responsibility to educate themselves, to go and seek additional resources, to ask questions if they're unsure, or to seek out methods of learning and knowing more. And so making a mistake is something that, you know, we're all human, we're all going to make mistakes. However, there is an individual level of responsibility. And also, let's be honest, with certain roles comes certain levels of responsibility. And so we try to create an environment whereby there is that support, whereby you can have those conversations, easy ones and very, very difficult ones. But we also have to understand that level of individual accountability. And whether you're right at the top of the organization, sitting at a council or a board, or you're very, very junior, we all have an input and we all have a contribution to make to that culture of inclusion. And so I say to people all the time, absolutely, leadership need to be leading from the front. They need to be doing and saying the right things, but each and every one of you impacts each other as it relates to that experience in a day-to-day role. And so let's not forget that. And let's also not sit back and wait for those from underrepresented groups to be the ones who educate us. right? We are very, very lucky compared to maybe 40, 50 years ago, whereby we now have access to a suite of resources. We can all access the internet at a push of a button, and therefore we can all take on a more active role as it relates to learning, particularly within this space. And so for me, within the FA, and indeed more broadly, it's about each of us taking that individual level accountability, supporting one another, and learning from experiences, mistakes in an empathetic way, but that in a way that doesn't negate or take away that individual accountability.
Evan, another one of the challenges, and it's kind of part of the brief of this panel discussion really, is how do we help to ensure that newer communities being included in football doesn't feel like other communities are being pushed out of the game? And I wanted to find out if there was any experience you might have had of that in terms of conversations in US soccer.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, making things comfortable for the status quo is not really my goal. So, you know, to the extent that an individual who is a recipient of all the accumulated advantages of the status quo feels put out, or their feelings get hurt because they suddenly find themselves in an equitable situation, is something that I don't have a lot of sympathy for on an individual level. Of course, I'm more than happy to have dialogue with those people and talk to them about the unfortunate way in which they find zero sums all over that are opposed to them. And but you know, I don't really have any, people aren't going to really express that, right? To me, at least, as a Black person talking about these things. They're not going to say to me, hey, Evan, I would love for you to come in here, but you know, all my white friends are feeling put out because they're not going to be able to do this, right? So I don't get to have those conversations. It would be interesting to know. But again, you know, no one was asking me about my feelings for the last 25 years in Major League Soccer and why I wasn't or was included or not included in certain roles and things like that. So I think what Edleen is doing over there, and you know, creating these spaces for open human dialogue is so essential, right? Because again, and her points are also well taken. In 2021, there are no excuses. You do have the responsibility to educate yourself. And if you, as a person of accumulated advantage who's taking advantage of the status quo, feels comfortable enough to ask a Black person about how that Black person or that woman or that BAME ethnic minority is making that the status quo person feel, if you're comfortable enough having that conversation, I would welcome that in a public forum. And I would find it interesting if very many people would actually even want to have that conversation.
Mm. Edleen, yes, let's come to you. I'm conscious we're running a little bit short on time.
Yeah, so I would just say, Evan, I think you're completely right. And I think really strangely, some people are bold enough to have that conversation, even with people from historically underrepresented groups. And I try to say to people, look, that the pie is big enough for all of us. And actually, if you believe that by some mechanism, those from underrepresented groups are coming to steal your position or steal your role or steal your access, that for me would lead me to create that you believe you're mediocre. And actually, you're not sure that you should actually be there in the first place. Because if you are good enough and you believe that the system is meritocratic, which is what a lot of people tell me, then surely by you being wonderful and fantastic, you're going to stay there anyway. And so for me, it's about, again, having that open and honest dialogue and saying, let's truly question whether this system has been meritocratic for years and years and years, or whether there has been some advantage. And if you want to have that conversation, I'm always open to having that conversation, because it means that what it needs us to do is to question, actually, am I here just because I am the best person and I am good enough? Or was I granted some advantage that actually I had no role or responsibility in? And for some people who ask that type of question, to Evan's point, what tends to come out is actually they realize I'm probably potentially here because of an advantage that I was granted that had nothing to do with the skills, the prerequisite knowledge, or indeed anything else. And that can be quite a powerful realization in the moment for a lot of people, but something that leads them to have some internal challenge and some internal question. And I welcome that as it relates to this topic in this area.
Great. Let's conclude then by throwing ahead to 2022. And if we were doing this panel again, what would you be hoping to be looking back on as an achievement, that another breakthrough you might have made in the forthcoming 12 months? Ebru, if I can come to you first.
I think, I mean, we talked a lot about the responsibility of the organizations, but important to shout on media conferences like this, who we are showcasing. This is a great diverse panel, right? And whoever is watching hopefully is inspired by this. But role models are extremely important, be it the good male allies or, you know, anyone who is from the underrepresented categories in their leadership positions. But equally important is, I think sponsors should be chasing how their money is being used. And many of these big sponsors in the sports world are actually very strict on their own EDI criteria and internal inclusive culture. So why not demand it as one of the KPIs from those organizations that they sponsor? And last but not least, fans are the biggest community within football. And as Edleen was saying during her talk around the FLDC, once you showcase this information, hopefully the fans will be more demanding of their beloved teams, beloved clubs, to make sure that that club represents fans like them also at all levels.
Yes, I mean, the role of fans is absolutely crucial, I think, in helping to bring about that change. Edleen, I mean, for you, what would be that takeaway you'd like to give our viewers, and an action that they can bring about change with in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so for me, one of the key elements would be being more open-minded about who can and who should enter the world of football, recognizing that there are talents and skills beyond the football landscape that can be brought in and can be developed. I think the second piece would be wider engagement of fans in a more positive way going forward. So, of course, we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement and a momentum in the UK, there were a lot of players taking the knee, and some fans were really vocal and really positive about that, and others not so much. And I think we need to take some of our fans on an educational journey around why a lot of these elements are important. And I think that kind of leads on nicely to a third area that I'm really focused on, and which activities over the course of this weekend have led me to be focusing on quite a lot today, which is online abuse of players and those within the kind of broader public landscape. Because there is more access to the internet, we now have mechanisms by which people can, under the cover, say really negative, really hurtful, and frankly discriminatory and abhorrent things. And from us, from an FA landscape, and indeed working with other football stakeholders, we need to drive that element of discrimination out of the game. And that is going to require collaboration with key tech giants and government supporting to drive forward that change that we all need to see, because there is no place for it, not only within football, but indeed within society.
This is a topic that's really close to my heart. The LGBT plus inclusion space that I work in, the work that the fan groups are helping to do around education, and should point out that it's the start of LGBT History Month here in the UK and Football v Homophobia Month of Action in February. Evan, to close with you then, which would be the breakthrough moment you might hope to see in the next 12 months in terms of your influence?
I mean, the key breakthrough, you know, for me would be for a club, an owner, to take the initiative and demand that, this is most likely a man, his peers make equity a mandatory rule. Again, football is a creation of rules. It's a fiction. And we have all these rules controlling everything. And for one of those very, very powerful individuals, of boards of individuals, to understand that the fans and their underlying employees and their sponsors all think this is a very important, and that they want to bring into alignment the words with actions, and being the person that spearheads and demands that, just like revenue sharing or fair play or whatever other rule they have, that making this something mandatory that goes beyond just being the good-hearted nature, charitable thing, creating something that is actually actionable, meaningful, and permanent.
I think that's a great note to close on, and I think it ties into our whole conversation on equity, and that essentially is where we're hoping to get to. Whether we talk about quotas in the future, or whether we don't. Equity seems to be the top word to come out of this panel discussion today. Thank you so much, Ebru, Edleen, and Evan, for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating to chat to you, and really, really appreciate that. And it's goodbye from me too. It's been a really interesting discussion, and it's been great to share the time with you. I'm going to hand now back to the studio.